I had grown accustomed to the peculiar rhythm of Hercule Poirot's morning rituals, but even after all these years, I found myself marveling at the precision with which he arranged his breakfast table. Each cup aligned to the exact degree, the morning papers folded with mathematical accuracy, his famous moustaches receiving their daily ministration of pomade, all performed with the solemnity of a sacred ceremony. I was absorbed in the racing results when our landlady announced a visitor whose distress seemed to precede her into the room like a tangible force. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, declining the chair he offered with a gesture, "I am Lady Catherine Thornfield, and I fear I am going quite mad. They tell me my husband died naturally, but nothing, absolutely nothing about his death was natural." Poirot set down his coffee cup with that deliberate care that indicated his complete attention. "Madame will perhaps sit. The mind, it thinks more clearly when the body is at rest. You speak of your husband's death as unnatural, yet they say otherwise. Who are these they, and what makes you so certain of their error?" She perched on the edge of the offered chair, her gloved hands clasped so tightly the leather creaked. "My husband, Sir Reginald Thornfield, was called the man who refused to die. Perhaps you've heard of him? The newspapers loved that phrase. He survived 3 separate attempts on his life, a climbing accident in the Alps that killed his partner, and a bout of pneumonia that claimed half his regiment. The doctors said he had the constitution of an ox and the stubbornness of a mule." "A formidable combination," murmured Poirot. "And yet he has now succumbed." 3 nights ago, during a family dinner at Thornfield Manor. 8 of us were present. Myself, his nephew Julian, who stands to inherit, Julian's wife, Vivian, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, who has been treating Reginald's recent bout of insomnia, Miss Dorothy Hartwell, his secretary, Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, Mrs. Blackwood, our housekeeper, and Madame Zelda, a spiritualist whom I had, rather foolishly, consulted about some recent disturbances. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Disturbances?" "Anonymous letters, Monsieur Poirot. Threatening letters. They began arriving a month ago, always with the same message. Even cats have only 9 lives." Reginald laughed them off, said they were the work of some disgruntled business rival. But I noticed he had begun locking his study door, something he had never done before. "And the manner of his death?" Lady Catherine's composure wavered. "He was in excellent spirits that evening, regaling us with stories of his latest business triumph. He had just announced his intention to make significant changes to his will. Said there were parasites who needed to be cut off from his generosity. Then, quite suddenly, he gasped, clutched his chest, and collapsed. Dr. Whitmore pronounced it a massive heart attack. Yet you remain unconvinced." "Reginald's heart was examined thoroughly just 6 months ago. Perfect condition. And there was something else. His signet ring was missing from his finger when we found him. He never removed that ring, Monsieur Poirot. Never. It bore the Thornfield family crest and had been worn by 5 generations." Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. "The ring that proclaims identity vanishes at the moment of death. Most suggestive, and I presume there were other irregularities." The study safe was found open the next morning, though Reginald alone knew the combination. Several documents were missing, including an earlier draft of his will and— She hesitated. Madame Zelda claimed she sensed malevolent forces in the house that evening. She said the spirits warned her that death would not come naturally to Thornfield Manor. "The spirits," said Poirot dryly, "are sometimes remarkably well informed about earthly matters. Tell me, Lady Catherine, when your husband announced his intention to alter his will, who appeared most interested in this news?" She considered carefully. "Julian went quite pale. His gambling debts are substantial. Vivian looked positively stricken. Miss Hartwell dropped her notebook. Even Mr. Pemberton seemed disturbed, though he tried to hide it. Only Madame Zelda appeared unsurprised, as though she had foreseen it. And Dr. Whitmore. He excused himself shortly after, claiming he felt unwell. Most unusual for him, Marcus has the constitution of an iron horse. Poirot rose and consulted his pocket watch. The little grey cells, they are already beginning to perceive patterns in this tapestry of human nature. Captain Hastings, if you would be so kind as to pack our bags, we shall accompany Lady Catherine to Yorkshire immediately. You'll come? Relief flooded her voice. But certainly. A man who refuses to die, yet dies most conveniently for some and inconveniently for others, c'est très intéressant. The psychology of this case, it promises to be most illuminating. As we prepared to depart, I noticed Poirot pause before his mirror, adjusting his tie with particular care. Hastings, he said quietly, we go to a house where death has visited a man who thought himself immune to its call. Mark my words, mon ami. We shall find that in this case the real mystery lies not in how he died, but in why he was allowed to live so long. The afternoon train to Yorkshire carried us toward Thornfield Manor, where a family's secrets waited like actors in the wings, ready to perform their carefully rehearsed deceptions for an audience of one very particular Belgian detective. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels provided a hypnotic backdrop as Lady Catherine's composure gradually dissolved, revealing details that painted an increasingly complex picture of her husband's final days. Poirot, with characteristic patience, drew these particulars from her like a skilled physician extracting a splinter. You mentioned your husband's business triumph, he said gently, his green eyes fixed upon the Yorkshire countryside rolling past our compartment window. Of what precise nature was this success? Reginald had just secured the Blackwood mining contract, a government deal worth nearly £500,000. It was the culmination of months of delicate negotiations, and he had outbid several competitors, including his own nephew Julian's investment firm. Her voice carried pride tinged with bitter irony. Julian had been so confident of securing that contract himself. He had even borrowed heavily against the expected profits. Ah, murmured Poirot, his fingers drumming that familiar precise rhythm against his knee. The plot, it thickens like good consommé, and this contract, it represented more than mere profit. It would have secured the Thornfield name for generations. But there was something else. Monsieur Poirot. She glanced nervously toward the compartment door. Reginald had discovered that someone within his inner circle was selling information to his competitors. He called it a serpent in the garden and swore he would expose the traitor that very evening. I exchanged glances with Poirot, whose expression had taken on that particular intensity, I knew well. The little grey cells were already at work. Thornfield Manor emerged from the late afternoon mist like a formidable sentinel, its dark Georgian stone seeming to absorb rather than reflect the dying light. Ancient oaks lined the winding drive, their gnarled branches forming a natural cathedral that whispered of secrets and old money. The manor itself possessed that austere grandeur peculiar to houses built by men who valued power over beauty, every line speaking of calculated dominance over the surrounding moorland. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, opened the heavy oak door before we could knock. She was a tall, gaunt woman whose black dress and granite expression suggested she had presided over this household's secrets for many years. Her greeting was correct but cold, her eyes assessing us with the practiced wariness of one accustomed to managing crises. Lady Catherine, the family awaits in the drawing-room as you requested. They are anxious to meet Monsieur Poirot. The drawing-room was a testament to masculine authority. Rich tapestries, dark paneling, and the lingering scent of leather and beeswax. 5 individuals sat arranged like pieces on a chessboard, each position seemingly calculated to reflect their relationship to the deceased. Near the fireplace stood Julian Thornfield, a man of perhaps 30, whose fair hair and weak chin suggested aristocratic breeding without accompanying strength of character. His restless hands betrayed the nervous energy of a habitual gambler. Beside him, Vivian Thornfield regarded us with calculating eyes. Her beauty was of the sort that required constant maintenance, and she wore her expensive clothing like carefully chosen armor. Every gesture spoke of a woman accustomed to using her appearance as both weapon and shield. Dr. Marcus Whitmore occupied a chair near the window, his medical bag at his feet and his steady hands gripping a teacup with barely concealed tension. He possessed the calm demeanor of his profession, yet something in his manner suggested recent disturbance. Miss Dorothy Hartwell sat primly at a writing desk, notebook open and pen poised as though ready to record our every word. She was perhaps 40, with the efficient manner of a woman who had sacrificed personal happiness for professional competence. A faint ink stain on her right forefinger and an escaped wisp of hair betrayed her recent agitation. Most intriguing was Madame Zelda, who occupied the chair nearest Sir Reginald's portrait. Younger than expected, perhaps 35, she possessed an unsettling intensity in her dark eyes and wore jewelry that caught every flicker of firelight. Her silk turban and theatrical manner proclaimed her profession as clearly as a medical diploma. Poirot bowed with continental precision to each in turn, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail of appearance and demeanor. "Mesdames, Messieurs, I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Sir Reginald was, by all accounts, a remarkable man. Perhaps you would be so kind as to describe that final evening? The smallest detail may prove significant." Julian cleared his throat nervously. Uncle Reginald seemed in excellent spirits. He was discussing his latest business success, rather pointedly, I'm afraid, and mentioned his plans to revise his will. Then quite suddenly he gasped, clutched his chest, and collapsed. "The timing," observed Poirot thoughtfully, "was most unfortunate. Or perhaps, for someone, most fortunate." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the mantelpiece clock's measured ticking and Miss Hartwell's pen scratching across paper. "Before we proceed further," Poirot continued, "I should like to examine the dining room where this tragedy occurred, and afterward, Sir Reginald's study. The scene, it often speaks more clearly than witnesses." As we prepared to leave the drawing room, I noticed how each person's gaze followed Poirot with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. The psychological game had begun, and already the detective's presence was disturbing the carefully constructed equilibrium of Thornfield Manor. Mrs. Blackwood led us from the drawing room with the measured steps of one accustomed to managing household crises, though her usual composure showed hairline cracks beneath Poirot's penetrating gaze. The dining room retained an oppressive stillness, as though the very air had been holding its breath since that fatal evening. The mahogany table, capable of seating 20 but bearing only the ghostly impressions of 8 place settings, dominated the space like a dark altar. Poirot paused at the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping the room with that peculiar intensity I had witnessed countless times before. He was not merely observing. He was reconstructing, his mind's eye peopling the empty chairs with suspects, filling the silence with the echo of final conversations. "The chair of Sir Reginald," he murmured, approaching the head of the table where an ornate carver remained pushed back at an awkward angle. "It tells its own story, n'est-ce pas?" He knelt beside it, producing his magnifying glass. "Observe, Hastings, fresh scratches in the wood made by something metallic being dragged across the surface with considerable force. Not the gentle rising of a man feeling unwell, but the violent recoil of one experiencing profound shock." Lady Catherine wrung her hands. "But what could have caused such marks?" "Perhaps," said Poirot, straightening with that satisfied expression indicating a significant discovery, "the same force that removed your husband's signet ring. The psychology of the dying moment, it reveals much about both victim and perpetrator." He moved methodically around the table, examining each place setting with scientific precision. At what had been Vivian's position, he paused, studying the arrangement of glasses with particular interest. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called to the housekeeper, "you cleared the table that evening. Was anything unusual about the beverages, the consumption patterns?" The granite-faced woman considered carefully. Well, sir, there was one peculiar thing. Sir Reginald's brandy glass, he always took Napoleon brandy after dinner, was completely empty when I cleared it, though the bottle showed barely any had been poured. Most unusual, as he was quite particular about his evening measure. Interesting. And the wine glasses. Dr. Whitmore had barely touched his claret. Miss Hartwell never drinks alcohol. Master Julian had requested a second glass of port, which was unlike him. He's usually most abstemious. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his fingers tracing invisible patterns above the table's surface. The psychology of consumption under stress, most revealing indeed. We proceeded to Sir Reginald's study, a shrine to masculine authority where dark leather volumes lined the walls like silent sentinels. The massive oak desk dominated the center, its surface bearing the organized chaos of complex business dealings. Behind it, Sir Reginald's oil portrait gazed down with the stern confidence of a man who had never known defeat, until now. The safe, a formidable Victorian construction, stood open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Its brass fittings gleamed dully in the lamplight, and the scattered papers within suggested hasty searching rather than methodical removal. The combination, said Poirot, examining the mechanism with professional interest, required considerable knowledge to open without force. Lady Catherine, you mentioned only your husband knew the numbers. So he claimed, though. She hesitated, coloring slightly. I did observe him opening it once. The combination appeared to be 1873, though I couldn't be certain. 1873, the year Sir Reginald's grandfather established Thornfield Industries. Julian interjected nervously from the doorway. Uncle Reginald mentioned it once, said it represented when real men built empires instead of squandering them. Rather pointed comment, I'm afraid. Poirot's attention shifted to the desk, where several documents remained scattered across the leather surface. Among them, most intriguingly, lay a half-finished letter in Sir Reginald's distinctive handwriting. With your permission? At Lady Catherine's nod, he read aloud, My dear Pemberton, the matter we discussed regarding irregularities in the mining contract bids has reached a critical juncture. I have identified the individual responsible for selling our confidential information, and I intend to confront them this very evening. The evidence is conclusive, and I trust you will prepare the necessary legal documents for— The letter ended abruptly, the pen abandoned mid-sentence. The confrontation he promised, whispered Lady Catherine. He was going to expose the traitor. Indeed. And someone was equally determined to prevent such exposure. Poirot moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening moors. Julian, your uncle's accusation regarding sold information. Did he indicate whom he suspected? Julian's face had gone quite pale. He looked directly at me when he mentioned having a serpent in the garden. But surely he couldn't have believed I would betray the family. Blood, observed Poirot quietly, has been known to flow quite freely when large sums of money are at stake, but we must not leap to conclusions. As we prepared to leave the study, Poirot paused before Sir Reginald's portrait, studying it with peculiar intensity. Hastings, he said softly, observe how the artist captured not just appearance, but essential nature. Pride, determination, and perhaps most significantly, absolute conviction of invulnerability to lesser mortal schemes. The irony was profound. The man who had refused to die had finally met his match, and somewhere within Thornfield Manor's walls, his killer walked free, believing themselves equally invulnerable to the schemes of one very particular Belgian detective. Tomorrow, Poirot announced, we shall speak with each person individually. Tonight, they will dine as usual, sleep as usual. Routine reveals much about human nature, and when people try to be something other than themselves, they invariably make mistakes. The game, as they say, was afoot. The following morning brought a persistent Yorkshire drizzle that seemed to weep against Thornfield Manor's ancient windows, each droplet carrying the weight of unspoken secrets. Poirot had risen before dawn, as was his custom when pursuing a particularly intriguing case, and I found him in the morning room arranging his notes with that methodical precision that indicated his little grey cells were working at full capacity. "Hastings," he said without looking up from his carefully organized papers, "observe how the household moves this morning. Each person's behavior will tell us much about their relationship to guilt and fear." Through the rain-streaked glass, we watched Julian pacing the terrace despite the weather, his cigarette consumption suggesting nerves stretched to breaking point. The previous evening's dinner had clearly disturbed the carefully maintained equilibrium of Thornfield Manor, and now, like sediment in stirred water, the truth was beginning to settle into visible patterns. "We begin with Miss Hartwell," Poirot announced, consulting his pocket watch. "The secretary sees all, hears all, yet is often invisible to those she serves. Such people possess dangerous knowledge." Miss Dorothy Hartwell entered with the efficient bearing of one accustomed to managing other people's affairs, though her usual composure showed subtle signs of strain. Her notebook was clutched rather than carried, and the ink stain on her fingers had spread, suggesting a restless night spent writing. "Miss Hartwell," Poirot began with characteristic courtesy, "you have served Sir Reginald for how long?" 15 years, Monsieur Poirot. I began as a junior clerk and worked my way to his complete confidence." Pride and something else, defensiveness, perhaps, colored her voice. "Complete confidence, a rare achievement in a man so careful with his trust. You were privy to his business dealings, his correspondence, his private concerns." She straightened, professional dignity asserting itself. "Sir Reginald trusted me with matters he shared with no one else. The mining contract negotiations, the investigation into information leaks, even his personal correspondence regarding Julian's gambling debts." "Ah, the gambling debts. These were substantial?" "Ruinous would be more accurate. Julian owed nearly £30,000 to various creditors, some of them quite unsavory. Sir Reginald had been quietly settling these debts to protect the family name, though he was growing increasingly frustrated with his nephew's weakness." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And the evening of Sir Reginald's death, you observed his mood, his interactions?" Miss Hartwell's composure flickered. "He was different that evening. Triumphant, yes, but also watchful. During dinner, he studied each person's face when he announced his intention to revise his will. It was as though he were conducting some sort of test." "What manner of test?" "I believe he was gauging reactions, looking for confirmation of his suspicions about the information leak. He had recently discovered that details of his bidding strategy had reached his competitors before the final negotiations." When Miss Hartwell departed, Poirot immediately summoned Julian Thornfield. The young man entered with the haggard appearance of one who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with demons, his fair complexion bearing the telltale signs of excessive drinking and nervous exhaustion. "Julian," Poirot began gently, "your uncle's death has clearly affected you deeply. Perhaps you would share your thoughts about that final evening." Julian's laugh held no humor. "My thoughts. I thought I was about to be exposed as a traitor and disinherited in front of the entire family. Uncle Reginald had discovered something about the mining contracts, and his manner suggested he blamed me. And did he have cause for such blame?" The young man's composure cracked entirely. "You must understand, Monsieur Poirot, I was desperate. The gambling debts, the threats from creditors, Vivian's constant demands for expensive things. When certain individuals approached me about Uncle Reginald's business strategies, the money they offered seemed like salvation. You sold information about the mining contract bids?" "God help me. Yes. But I never intended real harm to come to Uncle Reginald. I thought he was invincible, that he could overcome any disadvantage. I never imagined my betrayal might lead to his death." "After he collapsed, you stepped onto the terrace?" "Why?" "I felt sick, genuinely sick. The guilt, the shock of seeing him fall just after he had looked at me with such accusation. I needed air, needed to think about what I had done. As Julian left, his shoulders bowed with guilt and grief. I observed the other household members through the morning room windows. Dr. Whitmore had departed early for his rounds, but not before checking his medical bag twice, an oddly compulsive action for such a methodical man. Vivian remained in her room, claiming a headache, though Mrs. Blackwood reported she had been seen at her window before sunrise, watching the grounds with unusual intensity. Poirot conducted brief interviews with the remaining suspects, each revealing layers of motive and opportunity. Dr. Whitmore's convenient migraine, Vivian's cold calculation about inheritance prospects, and even Madame Zelda's theatrical pronouncements about malevolent forces all contributed to the complex psychological portrait emerging from the investigation. "The psychology of guilt, Hastings," Poirot observed as we prepared for the afternoon's inquiries, "creates its own prison, but guilt and murder are not always synonymous. Our Julian is certainly guilty of betrayal, but is he guilty of the ultimate crime? The pattern begins to emerge, but several pieces remain missing from this most intriguing puzzle." The investigation was far from complete, and somewhere within Thornfield Manor's walls, a murderer continued to believe themselves safe from the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. The afternoon brought a shift in the Yorkshire weather, and, with it, an unwelcome visitor whose confidence seemed as solid as the ancient stones of Thornfield Manor itself. Inspector Morrison arrived with the purposeful stride of a man who believed he had come to collect a solved case, his weathered face bearing the satisfaction of 30 years pursuing criminals across the moors. "Monsieur Poirot," he announced without preamble, "I've reviewed the evidence, and I believe we have our man. Young Julian Thornfield's guilt is written across every aspect of this case as clearly as his signature on a promissory note." Poirot, who had been examining the seating arrangement Mrs. Blackwood had sketched for us, looked up with that deceptively mild expression I knew so well. "Indeed, Inspector, how fascinating. Perhaps you would share your reasoning." Morrison consulted his notebook with theatrical precision. "Motive is clear. Gambling debts of £30,000 and the threat of complete disinheritance. Opportunity was perfect. He dismissed the footman, giving him access to manipulate his uncle's brandy without witnesses. The missing signet ring suggests a struggle or hasty theft, and the opened safe indicates he was searching for the will or destroying evidence of his business betrayals." "A most comprehensive theory," Poirot murmured, his fingers tracing the seating diagram. "Yet I find myself troubled by certain psychological inconsistencies. Tell me, Inspector, when you examined Julian this morning, what was his precise mental state?" "Nervous wreck, obviously. Guilt written all over him. He practically confessed to selling his uncle's business secrets, and when pressed about the murder itself, he broke down completely." Dr. Whitmore, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with professional concern. "Inspector, I must interject. I've examined Julian extensively, and while he is indeed suffering from severe nervous collapse, his condition stems from overwhelming guilt about his business betrayals, not from committing murder. The young man genuinely believes himself responsible for his uncle's death because his information selling created the circumstances that led to it." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Dr. Whitmore speaks with wisdom. The psychology of guilt, it can be more destructive than the crime itself. Julian confesses not because he murdered his uncle, but because he feels his betrayals made murder necessary." Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. "Are you suggesting I should ignore clear evidence of motive and opportunity?" "I am suggesting, mon ami, that you consider the physical evidence more carefully." Poirot moved to the dining room, gesturing for us to follow. "Observe the scratches on Sir Reginald's chair. They run toward his right side as though something metallic was dragged across the wood with considerable force. The missing signet ring, worn on his right hand, tells its own story of violent removal." He positioned himself at the head of the table, his keen eyes studying the arrangement. Mrs. Blackwood's seating chart reveals that Vivian sat to Sir Reginald's right, with Miss Hartwell and Mr. Pemberton along. That same side, The angle of these scratches suggests the ring was removed by someone in that position, not by Julian, who sat to the left. But the dismissed footman, Morrison began. Ah, yes, the dismissed footman. Most convenient for creating privacy, but consider this. A man planning premeditated murder would hardly draw attention to himself by making unusual arrangements. Julian's action was that of a nephew dreading a family confrontation, not a murderer preparing his crime. Inspector Morrison frowned, his certainty beginning to crack. Then how do you explain the open safe, the missing documents? The safe, said Poirot thoughtfully, was opened by someone who knew the combination, 1873, the founding year of Thornfield Industries. This suggests either intimate family knowledge or careful observation. The missing documents may have been removed not to hide Julian's guilt, but to conceal someone else's more damaging secrets. Lady Catherine, who had been following our discussion with growing hope, stepped forward. But if Julian didn't kill Reginald, then who did? And why allow him to suffer this torment? Poirot's expression grew grave. Because, madame, the real murderer has found the perfect scapegoat. Julian's genuine guilt about his business betrayals provides ideal cover for someone whose crimes are far more serious. The psychology is quite elegant. Allow the innocent man to destroy himself with misplaced guilt while the true culprit walks free. This is all very theoretical, Morrison protested, though his tone lacked its earlier conviction. Without concrete evidence. Evidence, Inspector? Poirot moved to the sideboard, examining the brass tantalus that held the decanters. Consider the brandy glass, found completely empty, though Mrs. Blackwood poured barely half a measure. The Napoleon brandy bottle showed minimal consumption, yet Sir Reginald's glass was bone dry, as our excellent housekeeper described it. He turned to face us, his green eyes holding that particular intensity that indicated his little grey cells were working at full capacity. Someone else consumed that brandy, Inspector. Someone who needed to dispose of evidence quickly and had both the opportunity and the desperate necessity to do so. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the renewed patter of rain against the ancient windows. Inspector Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his neat theory crumbling under the weight of Poirot's methodical analysis. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot," he said finally. "If you're so certain Julian is innocent, prove it, but I warn you, without definitive evidence, the circumstantial case against him remains strong." Poirot smiled, that enigmatic expression that had preceded the solution of so many seemingly impossible cases. "Evidence, Inspector? Tomorrow evening I shall provide evidence. But first, I require one final gathering of all our suspects. We shall reconstruct that fatal dinner, and I shall demonstrate not only who killed Sir Reginald Thornfield, but why they believed themselves clever enough to commit the perfect crime." As Inspector Morrison departed, clearly unsatisfied but unable to refute Poirot's logic, I observed the household's reaction to this development. Relief flickered across several faces, but I noticed that Vivienne's expression remained carefully neutral, while Madame Zelda watched Poirot with the calculating gaze of a predator recognizing a worthy opponent. The game was entering its final phase, and somewhere within Thornfield Manor's walls, a murderer was about to discover that Hercule Poirot's reputation for unraveling the most carefully constructed deceptions was entirely deserved. "Hastings," Poirot said quietly as we returned to our rooms, "tomorrow we shall witness the final act of this psychological drama. The murderer has allowed an innocent man to suffer for their crime, and this, mon ami, I cannot permit. Justice, she may be blind, but she is not deaf to the voice of truth." The evening following Inspector Morrison's departure brought an unusual stillness to Thornfield Manor, as though the ancient walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of revelation. Poirot had spent the afternoon in contemplative silence, arranging his notes with that methodical precision that indicated his little grey cells were approaching their final synthesis. When he finally spoke, it was with the quiet confidence of a master strategist positioning his pieces for checkmate. "Hastings," he said, consulting his pocket watch. "Tonight, we dine as Sir Reginald's guests did on that fatal evening. But this time, we shall observe not just what is said, but what remains unspoken. The psychology of guilt, it creates its own prison, and the guilty party will reveal themselves through their very attempts at concealment." Mrs. Blackwood had arranged the dining room exactly as it had been 3 nights prior, down to the precise placement of the Napoleon brandy in its brass tantalus. The same 8 chairs surrounded the mahogany table, though now they seemed to bear the weight of unspoken accusations. As the household gathered, I observed how each person's demeanor had subtly shifted since our arrival. The careful composure of those who knew they were being watched. Poirot took his seat with ceremonial gravity, his keen eyes cataloguing every gesture, every fleeting expression. "My friends," he began as the soup was served, "I find myself fascinated by the psychology of that final evening. Sir Reginald announced his intention to expose a traitor, to revise his will, to cut off certain parasites from his generosity. Such pronouncements must have created considerable anxiety among those present." Vivian's spoon trembled almost imperceptibly as she lifted it. Reginald was always dramatic in his announcements. We had learned not to take his threats too seriously. Ah, but this time was different, was it? Not. Poirot's tone remained conversational, yet I detected the steel beneath the silk. This time, he possessed concrete evidence. The unfinished letter in his study speaks of conclusive proof regarding the information leak. Someone at this very table knew their deception was about to be exposed. Julian shifted uncomfortably, his guilt about the business betrayals written clearly across his features. Yet Poirot's attention seemed focused elsewhere, his gaze moving systematically around the table like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. "Consider the curious matter of Sir Reginald's brandy glass," he continued, gesturing toward the tantalus. Mrs. Blackwood found it completely empty, though she had poured barely half a measure. A man suffering a sudden heart attack does not typically finish his drink with such thoroughness. Unless, of course, someone else required the contents of that glass to disappear entirely. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Are you suggesting the brandy was somehow tampered with?" "I suggest nothing, Doctor. I merely observe that certain substances, when introduced into alcohol, can mimic the symptoms of cardiac arrest most convincingly, and such substances would leave traces that a careful murderer would wish to eliminate quickly." Poirot's eyes moved to Vivian, who sat precisely where she had that fatal evening, within easy reach of Sir Reginald's glass. "But surely," interjected Pemberton nervously, "a post-mortem would have revealed any foreign substances." "Would it indeed?" Poirot smiled enigmatically. "That assumes, of course, that someone wished such an examination to take place. Dr. Whitmore, your immediate diagnosis of natural causes was most convenient for someone, was it not? It eliminated the necessity for uncomfortable questions about the true cause of death. The psychological pressure was building like steam in a kettle. Miss Hartwell had stopped eating entirely, her notebook forgotten beside her plate. Madame Zelda's theatrical composure showed hairline cracks, her usual dramatic pronouncements replaced by watchful silence. "And then there is the matter of Sir Reginald's missing signet ring," Poirot continued relentlessly. "A family heirloom he never removed, yet it vanished at the moment of his death. The scratches on his chair suggest it was torn from his finger with considerable force, the desperate action of someone who needed to eliminate evidence of their final struggle with him." Vivian's composure finally cracked. "This is monstrous speculation, Monsieur Poirot. You're suggesting one of us murdered Reginald in cold blood." "I suggest only that the truth has been carefully concealed beneath layers of deception and misdirection. But truth, like water, always finds its way to the surface." Poirot rose from his chair with deliberate ceremony. "Tomorrow evening I shall gather you all once more in this very room, and then, mes amis, we shall discover not only who killed Sir Reginald Thornfield, but why they believed themselves clever enough to commit the perfect crime." As the household dispersed in heavy silence, I observed how guilt had transformed each person's bearing. Somewhere within these walls, a murderer was spending what might be their final night of freedom, wondering whether Hercule Poirot's legendary reputation for unraveling the most carefully constructed deceptions was about to prove itself once again. The stage was set for the final act of this psychological drama, and tomorrow would bring either justice or the perfect crime's ultimate triumph. The restless night that followed Poirot's psychological assault brought little peace to Thornfield Manor's inhabitants. I awoke before dawn to the sound of movement throughout the house. Footsteps in corridors, doors opening and closing with careful deliberation, the subtle sounds of a household where no one slept easily. From my window, I observed Dr. Whitmore departing unusually early for his rounds, his medical bag clutched with white-knuckled intensity, while in the frost-covered garden below, a solitary figure paced the paths despite the bitter morning air. Poirot was already seated in the morning room when I descended, his attention focused not on his customary newspapers, but on a collection of items arranged with characteristic precision on the side table. His expression held that particular satisfaction I had learned to associate with pieces of a complex puzzle finally revealing their proper positions. "Hastings," he said without preamble, "observe how guilt transforms human behavior. Our household has become a laboratory of psychological pressure, each person reacting according to their relationship with truth and deception." Before I could respond, Mrs. Blackwood appeared at the doorway, her usual granite composure finally showing hairline cracks. The strain of maintaining household order while harboring dangerous knowledge had clearly taken its toll on the formidable housekeeper. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion, "I can no longer remain silent. There's something about that evening, something I witnessed but dared not speak of until now." Poirot set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his keen eyes immediately focusing on the distressed woman. "Mrs. Blackwood, please sit. Your conscience, it has been troubling you, n'est-ce pas? Sometimes the burden of knowledge becomes too heavy to bear alone." The housekeeper perched on the edge of a chair, her hands twisting in her starched apron. After Sir Reginald collapsed, while everyone was in shock and confusion, I remained in the dining room to maintain order, you understand. In such moments, someone must think of practical matters. It was then I observed someone moving with great purpose near Sir Reginald's chair. "Continue, madame. Every detail may prove significant." This person went directly to where he had fallen, and I distinctly saw them remove something from his hand, something that caught the lamplight as they slipped it quickly into their pocket. Then they moved to the sideboard, to the brandy decanter, and I watched them pour the remaining contents of Sir Reginald's glass back into the bottle. The revelation struck like lightning, illuminating crucial aspects of the crime that had remained shadowed. Poirot leaned forward intently, his little grey cells working at full capacity. "This person? You observed them clearly?" Mrs. Blackwood nodded slowly. "Clear enough, sir, though at the time I thought it merely tidying up. But now, with all that's happened, I realize it was something far more deliberate. Indeed, the removal of evidence, the elimination of traces that might reveal the true cause of death." Poirot rose and moved to the window, his reflection in the rain-streaked glass appearing almost ghost-like. "And there is more, is there not? For I perceive that your distress stems from more than this single observation." "Yes, sir. Yesterday, while cleaning Sir Reginald's study, I discovered something that had been overlooked in our initial search." She produced a folded document from her apron. A codicil to his will, already prepared but unsigned. It was hidden beneath other papers in his desk drawer. Poirot examined the document with intense interest, his eyebrows rising as he absorbed its contents. Most illuminating indeed. This codicil would have dramatically altered the distribution of Sir Reginald's estate. Substantial bequests removed, others significantly reduced, and new provisions that would have caused considerable disappointment among certain beneficiaries. The implications were staggering. The unsigned codicil revealed motives far beyond what we had previously understood, creating a web of financial desperation that encompassed multiple members of the household. "The psychology becomes clearer," Poirot murmured, returning the document to Mrs. Blackwood. Sir Reginald's announcement about revising his will was not mere threat. It was accomplished fact, requiring only his signature to devastate certain expectations. As Mrs. Blackwood departed, visibly relieved to have unburdened herself, Poirot turned to me with that expression of quiet confidence that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "The net tightens, mon ami. Our murderer believed themselves clever, but they have made the classic error of underestimating both human observation and the persistence of physical evidence. Tonight, when we gather for the final time in that dining room, we shall demonstrate that no crime, however carefully planned, can withstand the relentless application of logic and the little gray cells." The morning had brought crucial revelations, but I sensed that Poirot was still withholding the final, devastating insight that would expose the killer's identity. The psychological game was entering its ultimate phase, and somewhere within Thornfield, Manor's walls, a murderer was about to discover that Hercule Poirot's reputation for unraveling the most carefully constructed deceptions was entirely deserved. "Hastings," he said quietly, consulting his pocket watch, "send word to Inspector Morrison. Tonight at 8 o'clock, we shall gather everyone in the dining room, and then we shall witness the final act of this most instructive tragedy." The hours before 8 o'clock stretched with a peculiar heaviness, each minute laden with the weight of expectation and hidden dread. Thornfield Manor, so recently a stage for polite rituals and veiled hostilities, now felt like a house suspended at the edge of revelation. Poirot, moving with unhurried certainty, seemed to draw the very threads of anxiety tighter with each measured step. Throughout the afternoon, he dispatched precise, seemingly innocuous instructions. Lady Catherine was to maintain routine without deviation. Mrs. Blackwood was to rest and speak to no one, and Inspector Morrison, arriving with quiet determination and 2 discreet plainclothes men, was stationed nearby as a silent insurance against panic or flight. I watched Poirot in the dining room, where he paused before the brass tantalus, adjusting the Napoleon brandy decanter so the label aligned perfectly with a flaw in the tray's edge. A detail so minute it seemed almost ritualistic, but I had seen him set such traps before, knowing the criminal mind would return to the scene by force of habit. "Human nature, Hastings," he murmured, "is most obliging when offered the opportunity to betray itself." We were midway through the corridor when a sharp crash from the service wing shattered the hush. Poirot was through the swing door before I could follow. Mrs. Blackwood, formidable no longer, was crumpled by the scullery steps, a broken teacup at her side and tea pooling in trembling islands. Dr. Whitmore appeared almost instantly, his bag open, pronouncing exhaustion as the cause. But Poirot's gaze was fixed on the rim of the shattered cup. He lifted a fragment with a handkerchief, inhaled delicately, and his nostrils tightened. "You gave her this tea?" he asked the kitchen maid, who stammered that Madame Zelda had brought the tray herself, claiming it was a mild infusion for the nerves. Madame Zelda, drawn by the commotion, stood at the threshold, color high, defending her concoction as harmless. Poirot's voice was gentle but implacable. "It is curious, madame, that you who consult spirits should meddle so with earthly teas." Her reply, as defensive as it was theatrical, did little to conceal her agitation. Ensuring Mrs. Blackwood was cared for and guarded, Poirot swiftly collected the broken porcelain. When the bustle faded, he summoned Madame Zelda to the morning room. Confronted with evidence of her correspondence, anonymous letters, typed in London on her portable machine, she faltered. Under Poirot's quiet, relentless questioning, she admitted to having written the first letters at Sir Reginald's suggestion to provoke anxiety and expose a traitor, but insisted the last 2 were not hers. The serpent in the garden, it seemed, had taken on a life beyond her control. No sooner had the air cleared than a shout echoed down the corridor. One of Morrison's men had caught Mr. Pemberton in the act of burning papers in the study. The solicitor, usually composed, was now sweat-beaded and desperate, claiming he destroyed documents only to shield Lady Catherine and the family from disgrace. Gambling debts, questionable donations, and a stipend to Madame Zelda, all detailed in Sir Reginald's instructions. Poirot, retrieving a scorched fragment, reminded Pemberton that order was not restored by the destruction of truth, but by its revelation. As the wind picked up outside, pressing rain against the windows, the house seemed to contract around its secrets. Upstairs, Vivian moved silently, her face unreadable, while Miss Hartwell stood by the landing window, her posture rigid with tension. Later, in the privacy of the morning room, Poirot arranged on the table the evidence gathered: a silver box from Sir Reginald's bedside and, most tellingly, a tiny glass vial he had found hidden in the study's waste bin. Holding it aloft with tweezers, he mused, "The genius of the criminal mind, Hastings, lies not in complexity but in elegant simplicity. This vial, meant for one potent dose, would induce symptoms indistinguishable from a cardiac event in a man of robust health. The swift removal of the brandy and the decisive diagnosis of natural causes. These were not merely practical, but essential to the plan." He turned, eyes alight with the excitement of a mind closing on truth. "The killer, mon ami, is one who possessed both the knowledge and access to such a substance, one who understood the power of appearances and the opportunities created by confusion and fear. But tonight we reveal not only their method, but the arrogance that led them to believe themselves beyond detection." As 8 o'clock neared, the household gathered in the dining room, each seat occupied as it had been on that fateful night. Lady Catherine composed herself by force of will. Julian avoided all eyes. Dr. Whitmore kept his medical bag close. Pemberton sat small and grey, Madame Zelda folded her jewelled hands, and Miss Hartwell pressed her lips to a thin line. Poirot stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on Sir Reginald's chair, and addressed the assembled company. "Mesdames, Messieurs, tonight you shall speak and act as you did before, but this time you do so under the eye of Hercule Poirot." As the mantel clock struck the hour, the room seemed to hold its breath. Poirot's gaze swept the table, every detail, every nervous glance, every trembling hand, recorded by those famous little grey cells. The final act had begun. The perfect crime was about to unravel into the full light of truth. The dining room held its breath as Poirot positioned himself at the head of the table, his small figure commanding absolute attention despite the storm raging beyond the ancient windows. The brass tantalus gleamed on the sideboard, its Napoleon's brandy decanter positioned with mathematical precision. The label aligned exactly with a tiny flaw in the silver tray, a detail so minute it seemed almost ritualistic, yet I recognized it as one of my friend's carefully laid psychological traps. "Mesdames, Messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying that peculiar authority that had commanded attention in drawing rooms across Europe, "we gather tonight to witness the final act of a most instructive tragedy. A tragedy in which the victim believed himself invulnerable. The innocent condemned themselves through misplaced guilt, and the guilty walked free through the calculated application of superior knowledge and intimate access." His keen eyes moved methodically around the table, cataloguing every nervous gesture, every telltale sign of mounting pressure. Sir Reginald Thornfield died not from natural causes, as was so conveniently diagnosed, but from a carefully administered dose of digitalis, a substance that, when concentrated sufficiently, produces symptoms indistinguishable from a massive cardiac event. The method was elegant, the execution precise, and the concealment of evidence both swift and thorough. Lightning illuminated the room briefly, casting dramatic shadows across faces already pale with apprehension. Poirot produced the small glass vial with theatrical precision, holding it delicately in the lamplight. This container, discovered hidden in the study waste bin, once held the instrument of murder. Digitalis, readily available to those with access to medical references and pharmaceutical supplies, metabolizes quickly, leaving minimal traces for subsequent examination. Most conveniently, it requires no specialized medical training to obtain or administer, merely careful research and desperate necessity. His gaze settled on Miss Hartwell, whose notebook lay forgotten beside her untouched soup. The psychology of this crime extends far beyond mere method. Consider the unique position of Sir Reginald's secretary. 15 years of complete trust, absolute access to his business affairs, his correspondence, his private documents. Such intimacy with every secret of the household provided both opportunity and the knowledge necessary to orchestrate an elaborate deception. Miss Hartwell's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she reached for her water glass. Monsieur Poirot, surely you cannot suggest— I suggest nothing, mademoiselle. I state facts. His voice carried that implacable quality I'd witnessed during his most brilliant expositions. The missing documents from the safe included not merely the unsigned codicil to Sir Reginald's will, but correspondence revealing a systematic pattern of embezzlement spanning several years. Someone had been manipulating household accounts, charitable donations, medical expenses, skimming substantial amounts with remarkable skill and intimate knowledge of the family's financial arrangements. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Lady Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her throat, while Julian stared in shocked comprehension. The pieces of the puzzle were finally arranging themselves into their devastating pattern. When Sir Reginald discovered this betrayal, Poirot continued relentlessly, you realized that exposure meant not merely dismissal, but criminal prosecution and complete social ruin. Your announcement about dismissing the footman created the privacy you required. Your position at the table, seated to Sir Reginald's right, provided perfect access to his brandy glass, and your comprehensive knowledge of everyone's secrets, Julian's gambling debts, the mining contract negotiations, the family tensions, offered ideal misdirection. Miss Hartwell's carefully maintained composure began to crack like ice under pressure. The evening of his death, you slipped the digitalis into his Napoleon brandy, knowing his habits so well that you could predict exactly when he would drink it. When he collapsed, you moved swiftly, removing his signet ring to eliminate traces of the substance you had used to handle the poison, pouring the remaining contaminated brandy back into the decanter to destroy evidence. No, she whispered, but the word carried no conviction. Her professional facade was crumbling, revealing the desperate woman beneath. The final irony, Poirot concluded, his voice gentle yet implacable, is that your greatest strength became your ultimate weakness. Your intimate knowledge of everyone's secrets, your access to all information, your position of absolute trust. These very advantages made you the only person capable of orchestrating such an elaborate deception while ensuring an innocent man would bear the blame. The storm outside seemed to pause, as though nature itself awaited her response. Miss Hartwell's confession, when it finally came, was barely audible above the renewed whisper of rain against Thornfield Manor's ancient windows. "He was going to destroy me," she said simply, her voice hollow with defeat. 15 years of devoted service, and he was going to see me imprisoned for trying to secure my future when he paid me barely enough to survive. The perfect crime had unraveled, thread by methodical thread, under the relentless application of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. Miss Hartwell's confession hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating, yet before its implications could fully settle into acceptance, Poirot raised his hand with that characteristic gesture I had witnessed countless times before. Precise, deliberate, and utterly commanding. "Non, mademoiselle," he said gently, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of compassion and implacable logic. "You speak of guilt, of desperation, of systematic embezzlement spanning many years, and in this you speak the truth, but of murder. Non. You did not kill Sir Reginald Thornfield. The effect was electric. Miss Hartwell stared at him in stunned bewilderment, her carefully constructed confession suddenly rendered meaningless. Around the table, faces reflected varying degrees of shock, relief, and renewed apprehension. Julian's expression shifted from horror to confused hope, while Lady Catherine gripped the edge of the table as though the room itself had begun to spin. "But Monsieur Poirot," Miss Hartwell stammered, "I have confessed to everything, the embezzlement, the access to poison, the opportunity." "Indeed, and your confession reveals the psychology of a woman consumed by guilt over financial crimes, willing to accept blame for the ultimate crime to end her torment. But the little grey cells, they distinguish between different forms of guilt. You are guilty of betraying Sir Reginald's trust through embezzlement, but you are not guilty of ending his life." Poirot moved with deliberate precision to the sideboard, his fingers tracing the brass edge of the tantalus. "This afternoon, I performed a small experiment. I aligned the label of this Napoleon brandy decanter with a tiny flaw in the silver tray, positioned it with mathematical exactness. When Inspector Morrison's men secured this room for tonight's gathering, the label had been moved. Someone had handled this decanter during the hours when all others were accounted for." He produced a small magnifying glass and indicated the crystal stopper. "Upon closer examination, we find traces of carmine, a distinctive shade of lipstick that matches precisely the cosmetics favored by one person in this household. Someone who could not resist returning to tidy what had once betrayed them. Someone whose obsession with appearances extends even to concealing evidence." His gaze moved slowly around the table before settling with devastating precision on Vivian Thornfield. Someone who sat at Sir Reginald's right hand that fatal evening in the position of intimate access and apparent devotion. Vivian's composure, so carefully maintained throughout our investigation, showed its first hairline cracks. "This is preposterous, Monsieur Poirot. Lipstick traces on glassware hardly constitute evidence of murder. Alone, perhaps not, but combined with other factors, they form a pattern most revealing." Poirot moved to stand behind Sir Reginald's empty chair, his hands resting on its carved back. "Mrs. Blackwood, if you would be so kind as to share what you observed on the evening of Sir Reginald's death." The housekeeper, who had been watching from the doorway with Inspector Morrison, stepped forward with renewed determination. "After Sir Reginald collapsed, while everyone was in shock and confusion, I remained in the dining room because someone had to maintain order. I saw Mrs. Vivian go directly to where he had fallen. She knelt beside him and I distinctly observed her remove something from his right hand, something that caught the lamplight as she slipped it quickly into her pocket. Then she moved to the sideboard and poured the remaining contents of his brandy glass back into the decanter." "The missing signet ring," Poirot observed quietly, "and the elimination of evidence. But there is more, is there not, Mrs. Blackwood?" "Yes, sir. The morning after Sir Reginald's death, I observed Mrs. Vivian in the garden before dawn, near the south hedgerow where the foxglove grows. She was carrying a small basket and appeared to be harvesting something." The revelation struck like lightning. Foxglove, Digitalis purpurea, the natural source of the poison that had killed Sir Reginald. Vivian's face went ashen, her carefully applied cosmetics suddenly appearing garish against her pallor. "The psychology of this crime," Poirot continued relentlessly, "required someone with intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's habits, someone who understood the household dynamics well enough to ensure suspicion would fall elsewhere, and someone with both the botanical knowledge and the desperate motivation to commit murder." He produced a small envelope from his jacket. "Inspector Morrison, if you would be so kind." Morrison stepped forward and tipped the envelope's contents onto the table. Sir Reginald's signet ring tumbled into the lamplight, its gold surface bearing the Thornfield family crest. "We found this hidden in Mrs. Vivian's jewelry case, concealed in a secret compartment beneath the false bottom of her powder drawer." The silence was profound, broken only by Julian's sharp intake of breath. Vivian, my God, why?" She turned on him with a look of such cold fury that I felt the temperature in the room drop perceptibly. "Why? You dare ask why? Your gambling debts, your pathetic weakness, your uncle's threats to disinherit us completely. Did you think I would simply accept poverty and disgrace? Did you think I would allow myself to become an object of pity among people who once envied my position?" "The unsigned codicil," Poirot observed, "would have cut off not merely Julian's inheritance, but your own substantial allowances and the comfortable lifestyle you had grown to consider your birthright. Sir Reginald's announcement about revising his will was not mere threat. The document was already prepared, requiring only his signature to devastate your financial security." Vivian's mask finally slipped entirely, revealing the calculating predator beneath the beautiful facade. He was going to destroy us over Julian's weakness and that secretary's petty thievery. 15 years I had devoted to this family, 15 years of playing the perfect wife to his worthless nephew, and he was prepared to cast me aside like a servant who had outlived her usefulness. "And so you decided that if Sir Reginald could not be persuaded to maintain your comfort, he must be prevented from living long enough to sign his new will." Poirot's voice carried profound sadness rather than accusation. "You prepared your poison from the foxglove in the garden, administered it through his Napoleon brandy, and when he collapsed, you moved swiftly to eliminate evidence while creating the appearance of natural death." "The digitalis from the foxglove," Dr. Whitmore said slowly, his professional mind finally grasping the full horror, "would indeed mimic cardiac arrest and my hasty diagnosis of natural causes." His voice trailed off in professional shame. "You could not have known, Doctor," Poirot said gently. "The symptoms were precisely what one would expect from a massive heart attack, and you had no reason to suspect foul play. The murderer counted on your professional competence and your desire to spare the family unnecessary trauma." Inspector Morrison stepped forward, his handcuffs ready. "Mrs. Vivian Thornfield, I'm arresting you for the murder of Sir Reginald Thornfield." As the steel bracelets clicked into place, Vivian's composure returned with chilling finality. "It seems," she said with bitter irony, "that Sir Reginald has achieved his final victory after all. The man who refused to die has managed to destroy me even from the grave." The perfect crime had been unraveled not through physical evidence alone, but through the relentless application of psychological insight and the understanding that human nature, however carefully concealed, inevitably betrays itself through the very actions meant to ensure its concealment. As Inspector Morrison led her away, her head held high in defiant dignity, I reflected on the tragic irony of her situation. She had possessed everything necessary to commit murder except the one thing that might have made it unnecessary: the ability to accept a reduced station with grace rather than destroy everything in pursuit of maintaining appearances. Justice served. The dining room emptied slowly, each person processing the revelation in their own way. Julian sat stunned, grappling with the knowledge that his wife had committed murder partly to protect him from the consequences of his own weakness. Miss Hartwell, freed from the burden of false guilt but still facing the reality of her embezzlement crimes, departed with quiet dignity to face her own reckoning with the law. Lady Catherine, though devastated by the betrayal within her own family, expressed profound gratitude to Poirot for preventing an innocent woman from bearing the guilt of a crime she had not committed. The truth, however painful, had restored a measure of justice to Thornfield Manor. Poirot's final reflection. Later, as we prepared to depart Thornfield Manor, Poirot paused before Sir Reginald's portrait in the study. The painted eyes seemed to regard us with that same stern confidence that had characterized the man in life, the absolute conviction of invulnerability that had ultimately invited the very betrayal that destroyed him. "Hastings," he said quietly, adjusting his hat with characteristic precision, "we have witnessed tonight the ultimate tragedy of human nature, how the pursuit of security and appearances can transform love into calculation, and devotion into murder. Sir Reginald believed himself immune to the schemes of lesser mortals, yet he was destroyed by the very intimacy he thought protected him. As our carriage pulled away from Thornfield Manor, the ancient stones seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The man who had refused to die had finally found peace, and justice, though delayed, had finally spoken with her clear, implacable voice. "Another case closed, Poirot?" I asked as the Yorkshire countryside rolled past our window. "Another demonstration, mon ami, that the little grey cells, when applied with patience and precision, can unravel even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The human heart, it may be capable of great evil, but it cannot long conceal its true nature from those who know how to observe." The train to London carried us away from Thornfield Manor and its tragic secrets, leaving behind a household forever changed by the revelation that the greatest dangers often wear the most beautiful masks. The dining room held its breath as Inspector Morrison's men led Vivian away, her composure intact even in defeat, while the remaining household grappled with the devastating revelation. Julian sat stunned, his face a canvas of grief and bewilderment as he processed not only his wife's betrayal, but his own unwitting role in creating the circumstances that had driven her to murder. Lady Catherine, though shaken to her core, found strength in the truth's harsh clarity. Better to know the serpent's identity than to live forever wondering which face concealed the poison. Poirot, with that methodical precision that always followed his most complex revelations, began addressing the remaining mysteries that had woven themselves through this deadly tapestry. "Miss Hartwell," he said gently to the secretary, who sat pale but relieved, "your embezzlement, though criminal, was born of desperation rather than greed. 15 years of devoted service for wages barely adequate to survival. This does not excuse your actions, but it explains them. You will face justice for your financial crimes, but you are free from the greater burden of murder." He turned to address the broader household. "Madame Zelda, your theatrical pronouncements and dangerous herbal concoctions served unwittingly as misdirection, though your conscience finally compelled you to attempt silencing Mrs. Blackwood when her testimony threatened to expose the truth. Mr. Pemberton, your destruction of documents stemmed from misguided loyalty to family reputation rather than criminal intent. Dr. Whitmore, your swift diagnosis of natural causes was both professionally sound and humanely motivated. You could not have suspected the elegant deception that exploited your very competence. As dawn broke over the Yorkshire moors, painting the ancient stones of Thornfield Manor in soft gold light, the household began the difficult process of rebuilding their shattered world. Miss Hartwell departed with quiet dignity to face her legal reckoning, while Julian remained to shoulder the dual burden of his gambling debts and his wife's crimes. Lady Catherine, though forever changed by the revelation of such intimate betrayal, found solace in knowing that justice had finally spoken with its clear, implacable voice. The London-bound train carried us through the morning countryside, its rhythmic clatter providing a soothing counterpoint to the psychological intensity we had witnessed. Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled in that familiar gesture indicating his little grey cells were processing the intricate web of human motivation we had untangled. "The psychology of this case, Hastings," he finally observed, gazing out at the passing landscape, "demonstrates once again that the most dangerous criminals are not those who plan elaborate schemes, but those who understand the fundamental weaknesses of human nature itself." Vivian possessed every advantage a murderer could desire: intimate access, comprehensive knowledge of household routines, and the psychological insight to manipulate others' guilt and fear. I reflected on the chilling efficiency of her crime, the cold calculation required to harvest poison from the garden foxglove, to administer it with such precision, and then to eliminate all traces with practiced ease. Her beauty, once a tool of charm and social advancement, had become a mask for ruthless determination. "What strikes me most profoundly," I observed, "is how Sir Reginald's very strengths became the instruments of his downfall. His trust in family, his confidence in his own invulnerability, his habit of dramatic announcements, all these characteristics were precisely what Vivienne exploited. Indeed, mon ami, the man who refused to die was ultimately destroyed by his inability to recognize that death sometimes wears the most familiar faces." Poirot's expression grew grave as he continued his analysis. He built an empire, but neglected the foundations of his own home. The great irony is that his desire to expose the parasites led directly to his demise at the hands of the most dangerous one of all. As our train approached London's outskirts, Poirot began organizing his notes with that methodical precision that indicated another case was being properly filed in his mental archives. The digitalis from the garden foxglove was particularly clever, a naturally occurring poison that would metabolize quickly, leaving minimal traces for subsequent examination. Combined with Dr. Whitmore's understandable desire to spare the family unnecessary trauma, it created perfect conditions for murder to masquerade as misfortune. The lights of London appeared through our compartment window, each glowing point representing our return to civilization and the normal rhythms of life beyond Thornfield Manor's Gothic shadows. Yet I knew that the psychological insights we had gained would remain with us long after the case files were closed. "Another demonstration, Hastings," Poirot said as we gathered our belongings at King's Cross Station, "that the human heart, however carefully it may conceal its true nature, cannot long withstand the patient application of logic and observation. Vivienne Thornfield believed herself clever enough to commit the perfect crime, but she failed to understand that perfection in murder, like perfection in all human endeavors, remains forever beyond our grasp." As we stepped into the London night, I reflected on the strange satisfaction that came from seeing truth triumph over deception, justice over calculation, and the relentless power of human observation over the most elegant criminal schemes. The case of the man who refused to die had reached its conclusion, leaving behind the eternal reminder that human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, remains forever transparent to those who possess the patience and insight to observe it clearly. The little grey cells had triumphed once again, and somewhere in the Yorkshire darkness, Thornfield Manor stood as a monument to the truth that no secret, however carefully guarded, can long survive the methodical application of Hercule Poirot's legendary powers of deduction.